All right. So, hi everybody. Welcome to the Comic Arts Workshop meetup. We do this once a month. We have at least lately we've been having 2 events a month because we were getting a lot of good speakers, and I don't want to wait a whole month before we have another one. So tonight we have Joan Hilty, who's got a pretty impressive resume, and she will talk about that. And so let's just get started, and I will let Joan introduce herself and tell us about herself. So
All
everybody,
right.
just for a nice round of applause for Joan. And go ahead, Joan.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me to your meetup. It's a pleasure to be here. So my current job is as the executive editor of a animation production company called Avatar Studios, which, for those of you who are familiar with Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra from Nickelodeon, is a brand new production studio. Well, about 2 years running now, that was formed by the co-creators Brian Konietzko and Michael DiMartino in 2020. It's a division of Paramount Animation out in LA, but I report to it remotely out of New York. Basically, what I do for the studio is that I coordinate all of the various stories being told across the new feature films that we're making, the new TV series that we're making, the publishing that has been ongoing for quite some time, and the video games that all sort of like form the narrative story of this very large universe that started with these two original TV series and has only continued to grow. I also sort of shape the story of the franchise itself. So I make sure that our events, our experiences, our social content, because we have a few dedicated social channels, and sort of other ancillary activity are all true to the world and the brand of Avatar. So that is basically what I do now. But I came to this world in kind of a funny way through comics. It's my first love, and there's a lot of uh, touchstones, as I think you all know, between comics and animation. That's what I'll talk a lot about tonight.
Now, is that unusual for, because usually when you hear about the studio, or you hear about a studio, they have several properties that they're working with, not just, it seems like Avatar Studios is just focused on the Avatar franchise. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, many of the studios that Nickelodeon works with are often focused on one property. Like, there are various studios dedicated, say, to the production of Paw Patrol. There's a particular production company dedicated to SpongeBob SquarePants. So this isn't that much different, except that, when Mike and Brian were asked to come back and form their own company, they were sort of like given the opportunity to form it under Nickelodeon Animation. So rather than being an independent studio, we are fully supported by Paramount / Nickelodeon Animation, which has been really great, essentially, to have them as a parent.
So would you say that a team that has a property, a creative team that has a property, they come in all, it sounds almost like you guys are subcontractors of Nickelodeon / Paramount.
Yeah, I mean, I am technically an employee of Paramount Animation.
Oh,
Um, so, but because it's all one big family, the features that we make are being handled by Paramount, and the TV content that we make are being handled by Nickelodeon. So it's the nature of the giant media company beast.
was it always like that? I got the impression before that that the business structure was different in the
Oh,
past.
it's changed a lot, and
Oh,
it's
okay.
still changing.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. But Nickelodeon was the very first home for Avatar: The Last Airbender. The original series ran on the channel from I want to say 2004. I can't believe I'm getting this wrong after all this time. Maybe like 2008 to 2010, something like that. And then the follow-up series, Legend of Korra, was 2012 to I want to say 2014 or 15. And then there was a pause. and Mike and Brian were briefly involved with the live action Netflix production, which was licensed by Nickelodeon to Netflix. That's not an unusual arrangement either. They parted ways creatively with them, but that production continued. As you know, that's come out and it's actually been pretty successful, and we're happy for them. We're just doing something a little different. We only make animation.
Got it. You know, my students have been trying to get me to watch Avatar, actually. So
I
I'm
am
gonna.
biased, but I recommend it highly.
Yeah. I heard the live action movie of Avatar didn't do so hot.
Thanks,
Yeah, that
Char.
was 2010.
Char, we're gonna save questions until the end.
Yeah,
Okay.
please feel free to ask me as many questions you want as Q&A.
Okay, we'll wait until the end for everybody else's questions. Now, Joan, so even though you're in animation now, you started off in comics, right? So how did
Yeah,
you
that's right.
get interested in comics?
So I've actually always been interested in comics. Like I drew them from a very early age, growing up in Northern California. I made my own comics. I read Archie. I was a huge fan of comic strips and political cartoons. My grandfather, my great uncle was a big fan of the political cartoonist, World War II political cartoonist Bill Malden. So I sort of came at it from that angle. When I was a preteen, I actually wound up taking a cartooning class at a local community college with the late great Trina Robbins. For those of you who know about her, she passed away this year. A truly amazing force for women in comics and alternative comics. She was one of my very, very first mentors. And you know, from high school through college, I drew editorial cartoons, illustrations for school publications. I didn't really get into like mainstream comic books until college. This would have been the mid 80s, and I sort of became a Marvel kid. Like I was actually never really into DC, ironically, even though I wound up working there for a very long time. I was into the Chris Claremont era of Marvel. Um, so I became a very big fan of that. After college, I moved back to my hometown. That was Brown University in Rhode Island. I moved back to my hometown of San Francisco, planning to become a syndicated cartoonist. Like that was what I thought I wanted to do. I wanted to be Bill Watterson. I wanted to be Kathy Guys White. I was not cut out for that at all. So it's actually very fortunate that all the syndicates rejected me. And I had to find another way to make a living. So I worked, as a freelance illustrator for a while. I became introduced to what at the time was a increasingly thriving underground comic scene among the queer community. This was the era of like gay comics and Real Girl and a whole bunch of comics that were sort of shepherded by wonderful, wonderful, amazing mentors like Howard Cruz and Jen Camper, Ivan Velez Jr., Allison
The
Bechtel.
90s? The 90s?
Yeah, yeah. The early 90s. They became my friends. I eventually moved to New York. I was, doing freelance illustration, doing these indie comics, but it wasn't a living yet. And through those appearances in indie comics, I actually gained a fan in the form of a young editor at DC Comics who befriended me. She said, "Hey, there's this new imprint at DC Comics that is trying to get more indie cartoonists involved." It was called Paradox Press. It was actually called Piranha Press at the time. It became Paradox Press. It eventually
I
became
love
a division
Piranha
of
Press.
Vertigo. Yeah, yeah. I was supposed to be considered for the big books, which is what Paradox became famous for. It never happened, but we struck up this friendship. And one day she said, "Listen, there's an opening for an assistant editor in my department, trading cards. Do you know anybody who might be interested?" And I said, I'll think about it. And I hung up the phone and I was like, what am I doing? I need a job. And I took it. And that was the next 15 years of my life. I started out as a assistant editor in trading cards. I had an opportunity to move over to Vertigo, which for those of you who aren't familiar, is the creator-owned comics division at DC Comics that was founded by Karen Berger, that was born out of Swamp Thing and Watchmen and many other, very, very ahead of their time comics, and was really kind of the first comic imprint run by a woman, and went on to do A Preacher, 100 Bullets, Why the Last Man, basically like comics that were tackling and reinventing like non-superhero, sci-fi, horror mystery series, years before it was fashionable. So it was a really interesting time to be there. After a while, long story short, I wound up moving to what was called the DC universe. So I also worked in licensed kids comics. DC was and still is a division of Warner. So that was the time when animation at Cartoon Network was starting to take off in some really interesting directions with Dexter's Laboratory, Powerpuff Girls, Adult Swim, Ben 10. And I wound up working on all those comics, those licensed adaptations. Eventually, I started working on superheroes. So that included like Blue Beetle, Flash, whole bunch of different projects. And that there too, I had the fortune to land at DC during a very interesting period. It was Infinite Crisis. It was, the original 52 series that was sort of like produced like a writer's room and spun off in all these interesting directions and became a huge smash for the company. It was a really, really interesting creative time to be there. But it didn't last. DC was starting to get its lunch eaten by Marvel. And eventually Warner Brothers in Hollywood decided to call its children home, and it downsized the New York office radically and moved it out to LA, and I was laid off. I was a little bit at loose ends. I knew I didn't want to work for another comics company. I was done, but I had really gotten into the notion that graphic novels were really starting to be a thing. This was 2010. And with an old buddy, I formed a little book packaging company called Pageturner. Our idea was that we would go to publishers and literary agencies and offer to like produce graphic novels for them, because then, and to a certain extent still now, a lot of mainstream book publishers like don't really have the resources for the workflow of comics. So we were offering to be a packaging house for them and or to adapt prose backlist into the graphic novel format. And it took a few years to get that off the ground, but we got that up and running. I continued to do freelance editorial at the same time, and eventually wound up being asked to do freelance work for Nickelodeon when they acquired Ninja Turtles in 2012. That meant that they got the whole Mirage catalog of Turtles. They needed to publish the old backlist. IDW was their partner, but they also needed to, manage a new Turtle series, and they knew nobody at Nickelodeon knew how to do comics, so they hired me. That went from a freelance gig to a full-time gig because they also started doing Avatar comics, Loud House comics, retro comics from like Rugrats and Rocko's Modern Life. But particularly Avatar, I got very wrapped up in because the comics were an immediate hit. Gene Yang did the first few arcs of them, and he had essentially been given free reign to continue the story of the world from where the series ended. So we were telling we were continuing the story canonically past the events that ended book 3, and for those of you who are familiar with the series, the 100-Year War. And I was working directly with the creators because Dark Horse had hired them as consultants. So that relationship deepened. I became full-time again at Nickelodeon Licensed Publishing. we diversified into young adult novels based in the Avatar universe. I worked on those. The franchise continued to grow. I started to feel really passionate about it. And then in 2020, during the pandemic, Mike and Brian said, hey, we're forming Avatar Studios. They're kind of giving us a lot of free reign to not just make new animated films and TV series, but to sort of have oversight or approval rights, at least, over all of the related content. And we're never going to be able to keep track of it all. And you understand the world really well. We like working with you. Join us. So I did. That's the story.
I
So
don't, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So that's my day job. And I also like still do a little work for Pageturner, but I've mostly stepped back from that. And as my bio says, I also teach at the School of Visual Arts, and that's still comics because I still stay connected to comics through supervising the publishing programs and through helping out with graphic novel programming for various festivals like the Brooklyn Book Festival.
You know, that is quite an amazing career path. And I would bet that you had no idea you would end up where you are now based on where you were, I guess, 20 years ago, right? I mean, you started off in trying to get into syndicated comics.
Yeah.
Now you're working for Nickelodeon, you know,
Yep.
running a franchise. Now,
Yeah.
going back to that syndicated comics content or mention, you said that you weren't cut out for it. What is it about syndicated comics that makes you say you weren't cut out for it?
I mean, the production cycle is insane. It's just like the way I could actually never be an animator. Like I can work with animators, but it requires so much attention to detail. It requires you to have weeks and weeks and weeks of comic strips done in advance. I did actually do my own self-syndicated comic strip for a while for the queer press called Bitter Girl, but that was weekly. A daily comic strip is
Yeah,
like
it's
it's incredible. It requires a work ethic you can't even imagine. Like I said,
years
it's
ago.
just as well.
Years ago, I read that Burke breathed would
Mhm.
lock himself in the room for until he finished 2 weeks worth of comics.
Yep.
And then he would go do whatever he wants for like a week or so, and then he would lock himself in the room again until he produced 2 weeks worth of comics. So
Yep. Yep. You'll hear the same story from everyone else who's still in that business, like Hillary Price. Yeah, it's just it's a grind. You really have to be cut out for it, and I wasn't.
do you think, I mean, I know we're do you think that uh, there is, I'm sure there is, but syndicated comic is not like it used to be because the newspapers aren't relying on cartoons anymore, and in fact, just newspapers are just having a hard time with having readers, right? So
Yeah, and I mean, everything's going online. Their readership is getting older and older and not being replaced, especially since, and I think we'll talk about this more later on, the habits of younger comic readers are increasingly moving online and not just into finding these comics within publications, but going to dedicated sites or going to web comics like Webtoons, Tapas, you name it. So yeah, it's a challenging business.
I know that you're not on the development side of animation, but I just want to ask you some general questions, and perhaps you can shed some light on this. And I'm sure there is no one way that this happens, but maybe there's a more common way than others. But how does a comic property usually become an animation?
I mean, I think it's better to think of it as a two-way street, because, you know, it's actually easier for me off the top of my head to think of uh animation that crosses over to comics.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like The Simpsons, Adventure
Right.
Time, Nimona. Um, I mean, obviously the forms are complementary, but they're different, right? So I think that there has to be a strong creative vision, um, that is like both works on the printed page, but can translate to the screen without necessarily mimicking the source material. Like, one classic example is Bruce Timm's Batman Adventures, right? Batman had been around for many, many years. And there had been Saturday morning cartoons, but there had been nothing like the Batman Adventures animated series. It was a completely unique artistic vision. You'd never seen anything like it in the Batman universe before. And I mean, another example is like Nausicaa, right? Miyazaki's Nausicaa, which, began as a incredibly detailed, low moving, gorgeously illustrated Mobius-like black and white manga that he wrote and illustrated. He never had any intention of its becoming on film, even though he was working in film at the time. But that's what happened. And the Nausicaa that we know as the movie, is it's the same story, but it's full color and much simpler, right? It only covers the first two books of the classic series. So I think those factors all come into play.
When I was watching a documentary recently about Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, I think that's his name,
Yeah.
right? And there was, and they seem to have some mixed feelings about when the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles became an animation. They had to adapt it to a much younger audience, because
Yeah.
the original books were usually mainly for teenagers and older, whereas the cartoons were targeting younger kids, like elementary school kids and even younger than that, because they were selling toys and all that stuff. So do you feel that that in animation you almost is it generally targeting a younger audience compared to, say, something like that Frank Miller would be doing on a I guess that's an obvious. Never mind. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, network animation, yes. And certainly Kevin and Peter, who I haven't worked that much with Peter, he really stepped back from, being involved with the franchise after they sold to Nickelodeon, but Kevin continued. I worked a lot with Kevin. He's a wonderful guy, total genius. And yeah, like he and Peter had to take these crazy black and white comics that were basically like Daredevil parody and think about how to make them into something toy and game and toy friendly for Saturday morning viewing. Big challenge. So for network, I would say yes, mostly geared towards younger kids. But even that's, I would say, starting to change because again, you have streaming platforms, especially Netflix, putting money into animation series that are not necessarily focused on young audiences like Arcane. And you have kids getting a lot of their content off of YouTube, where it actually like skews a little older than traditional TV animation does. So there's sort of, I think that's a positive development for American animation because it means that, it's no longer thought of as only, kid stuff.
I think it's also just the younger generations are watching animation far longer than previous generations. After a while, like for me myself, I mean I'm a Gen Xer, and my kids, they're already in their 20s and they're still watching animations, whereas I don't watch animation as much. So.
Yeah, well, and there's more and more the sort of animation being made that stands the test of time. Like again, I'm biased, but one of the staying strengths of Avatar is that it was very, very ahead of its time. It was unusual. It was at a time when Nickelodeon was not doing episodic, like long form storytelling. It was a long form story. Like it was a hero's journey through a war that had been raging through 100 years, where he had sole responsibility to take down, the bad guy and save the world and restore balance. And it was very sophisticated, for the mid 2000s filmmaking, because it was taking from a lot of anime at a time when anime was not popular in the States. And it was tackling very, very mature themes. I mean, it literally starts with a genocide. And nobody was doing anything like that. So that stuck with people who were kids watching it at the time, and they have reintroduced their kids to it over time because they still resonate with the themes as adults, but it's still a really fun series to watch as a kid.
Now, I in those list of questions I sent you, I asked you what are the challenges of working on a show based on a comic. But it seems like that the question is actually flipped. It's you're working on comics based on an animation, or are you working on everything?
Yeah. So is the question, what does my job look like from a day-to-day?
I guess what's the biggest challenge in what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is I've kind of only ever done the opposite. I've done much more work working on comics based on animation than vice versa. Although, the Avatar comics are so good that may change. We have lots of original ideas, but who knows? We may wind up adapting them someday. But the transition between that story on the printed page and that story on TV requires, again, flexibility and either sticking to or being able to translate a very strong creative vision. The visual language is different, right? Like you can have somebody, nod and then shake their head in animation, and you can't do that in comics, at least in a panel. The language is totally different. The tone is delivered through voice acting and animation, and in comics it's delivered through the visual language of lettering. In animation, all the character design has to be considered totally three-dimensionally, where everything sits in space. In comics you can be a little more flexible. So those are some of the different things that you have to think about.
Now here's a question, and somebody mentioned this to me before. I was in a conversation, somebody said, you've got an animation, why do you want to go into comics? So it seems like in animation you have a much wider reach, and comics seems to have a very limited audience. So why would a company that has a property that's being animated, or that's animated on available on streaming service, want to present it again as a comic?
Well, is this a question about the company's decision or the owner of the intellectual property? Because when we talk about the owner of the property, we're talking about, either a big media company or somebody who's made their own graphic novel and might want to see it translated onto the
media
screen.
company, like why would like say Avatar, right? So Avatar is this hit show, right? That's an animated. Why would you want to make comic books?
Because the comic, again, once you get into printed comics, they're already skewing a little bit older, and they already have the potential to capture the audience for the original series that is hungry for the story to be continued. But because of the politics and budgets of animation, the fact was Brian and Mike felt they only had this one story to tell. They had others, but it ended, and then they decided they wanted to tell the sequel of the next Avatar, and the whole storytelling in between had been left out. And they were both comics fans. They both, Brian had, studied sequential art himself. Mike was a comics person. They saw the potential to sort of tell some of these stories they hadn't been able to get around to in the form of comics that were dedicated to 13 and up, which was actually a little older than what they had been made to produce TV content for, which is generally more like 6 to 11, right? So they had the opportunity to skew a little bit older. they had the opportunity to tell the stories affordably, because comics at the end of the day is still cheaper to produce than animation. And they're just different audiences, right? Like a lot of comics and animations, consumers are one and the same, but there's still variety. You're just you're expanding your audience
So
if you
yes.
traffic in both.
So I guess it basically just they just had more stories to tell, and
Mhm.
it's just and the comics, the medium was another way, or maybe an easier way to be able to get out more stories, and also
Yeah,
reach other audiences that that might not be who their target was with the animations.
yeah, and I mean, I even noticed this way before I started working at Nickelodeon at DC, when I was working on the Cartoon Network comics. The creators like Gendy Tartakovsky with Dexter's Laboratory and Craig McCracken with Powerpuff Girls, um, and like even the Space Ghost guys, they loved working on the comics, because even though they were often the creators of the shows, they had all this creative control in the studio. There were storylines they couldn't get away with that they could get away with in comics.
That's interesting.
Their favorite artists on the shows would get, and this is why a lot of the writers and artists on the shows would like doing comics. You like your name. If you're lucky, you might direct an episode, or you might get like a storyboard credit. But like in comics, you get a byline, right? You're like, it's written by, Gendy Tartakovsky. It's
That's
penciled by Matt Jenkins. And in a show, often they're just like a line in the credits, and they liked having bylines.
and it never occurred to me that
Mm-hmm.
there would be that aspect of animation and want to be able to tell more stories. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open up to the audience. Now, for a while, it seemed like a lot of media companies, especially streaming companies, were hungry for content. Is that slowing down, or is that still the case?
I mean, when are media companies not hungry for content? Like that's their business model, right?
Right.
I mean, I think the real question is like, do they know what to do with it? Right there, I think you're right that we are seeing a little course correction in media companies, churning out streaming series that all sort of have a certain sameness to them, or that are a vanity project, or that they think are going to grab an audience that ultimately doesn't happen. They're starting to be a little more selective. And I mean, this actually kind of ironically to me mirrors publishing, where for a long time, this was my experience, all the publishers wanted to get in graphic novels. They were like, we want that graphic novel content, but they would like buy one project, because it was the era of like Mouse and Fun Home. And then they would just like pay too much. They would pay a lot of money for it, throw it at the wall. They had no idea how to market it. And then they would be like, and it wouldn't make money. And they would be like, we're not doing that again. And now they're starting to think a little more creatively and carefully about how to create graphic novels. They're like actually establishing divisions like Inklore at Random House or Harper Alley at HarperCollins that have a vision for the graphic novel. And I think it's also true for media companies. That's, I think, why Nickelodeon decided, let's take this property and like really pay some attention to it, and get both film and TV out of it. So the real question is like, you know, are they a good custodian for the content, and do they believe in it, and do they have like a long-term plan for it and an understanding of what its audience is? I think everyone is thinking more carefully about that now.
Awesome. So, okay, well, that's good to hear. I was afraid that that an era was shutting down. So, anyways, and does anybody have any questions for Joan? Anybody would like to?
Oh, I've got one question.
Sure, Char.
Are you, Joan, are
Yes.
you and other companies planning to use artificial intelligence for animation as a tool and not a replacement one day?
That's a good question. I can't speak for other companies. I can tell you that Avatar Studios does not support the use of AI generated content. And in fact, we have flagged it when we have been presented, when we've seen evidence of it in like presentations that partners give us or even mock-ups. Obviously, it's here to stay. And I actually talk about this a lot in the class I teach as well. It's not going away. We have to figure out a way to utilize it in a way that it can be a creative tool, but so that like people's rights can be protected and they can only opt into having their data done. But at the time, we have a policy of not using it.
Yeah,
That's a good
because
point,
the
Char.
animation industry is being a little chaotic
Mm-hmm.
because of AI, but it'll calm down in a few years, right?
We've got to figure out how to work with it. That's my feeling. We got to figure it out. So yeah, it's going to be chaotic for a while, but it's here to stay. So we have to figure out like how to make it a fair playing field.
Yeah, and just like we had to do with the machines and the internet.
Okay, Char, I'm going to ask other people if you have questions, okay? Thanks so much.
Okay.
That was a great question. Anybody else?
Hi,
I
everyone.
see. Yeah, go ahead, Greg. Hi.
Hi, you mentioned online comics and then skewing a little bit older, and then the print, which is the direction that you're headed, being a little bit more mature and some of the stories being told. Has your company or the industry in general been considering, because online seems like it's going to grow in popularity, and the pros and cons of going the online route versus the print route?
Yeah, so the way that, again, the way that an IP intellectual property like Avatar appears in print is that we license the right to make a particular type of story, in this case a comic, to a partner like Dark Horse. So Dark Horse for a long time has done print comics of Avatar. But recently, noticing the success in the US of the Webtoon platform, they entered into a partnership with Webtoon where you can now read the original print comics of Avatar on the Webtoon app. So they're the same comics that have been produced and are still available in print if you prefer to read it that way since 2012. But you can now also go to the Webtoon app and read Avatar: The Last Airbender in like the very popular online scrolling format. So there's an awareness that, we have to diversify in that direction. I don't think we'll ever leave print entirely. It's sort of, everyone panicked about webcomics for a while. It's sort of like everyone thought that VHS would be the death of theaters. I don't think that's what happens, but you're seeing more experiments in that direction.
If I could quickly follow up on Char's question with your response there, because you're looking at moving print to online. Do you think the industry has any objections to using AI in order to do like bubble translation or reformatting the existing content, which was laid out for print, into an online format? Or is it more just on the creative side that the objections would occur?
I mean, that's a good question. I think that translation probably is one of the applications of AI that might make headway in comics, especially with the increasing popularity of manga, and potentially the need for, maybe AI to do a baseline translation and then for someone to fine tune it. But again, I think we have to watch that carefully, right? Because, the recent Hollywood writers' strike, the concern there was that AI would do the baseline work, write scripts that were crappy and not well considered by humans, and then they would be called in to punch them up, but for less money, right? So again, I think, yes, maybe some applications are inevitable, but it's a little early to tell.
I saw a meme this morning. and somebody was saying that they want AI to wash the dishes and clean the house so they can make comics and be creative. So,
Mhm. Yeah.
well,
Um,
in the case, Jamie has a question.
Hi, good evening, and thanks for spending this time. And it's amazing that you're both an executive as well as in academia. I wanted to know, what do you see as like the multidisciplinary approach to somebody who wants to be in animation, comic book development beyond just the raw talent?
mhm.
What do you see as like the successful animator doing in your company today and in the future? And what kind of advice do you give the students in school as
I mean,
well?
it's interesting. Just the act of teaching comics professional practice, which I started doing in 2011, has been kind of a self-education process for me. Because the curriculum, when I took it over, was totally focused on, oh, you all, of course, want to go into print comics. If you want to do animation, go to the animation department. And that's not really the way the world works anymore. It's much more common for people to think about hybrid careers, right? Like maybe they'll make their money storyboarding while they work on their dream graphic novel at night. Or maybe, you know, they'll become character designers. Maybe they'll, you know, do their own web comic with the hope of being able to develop into a network pitch someday. There's like a I encourage them to follow a hybrid path. But I guess I would say generally, and this is the advice I give my students, that, you know, whatever version of that path you're considering, whether you want to sort of like look at both possibly being able to move back and forth between comics and animation, or you want to sort of focus more on one or the other, is to educate yourself professionally about the industry news, like follow the industry news, follow Heidi McDonald's Comics Beat is fantastic for both comics and animation, but especially comics. For animation, you've got Animation Magazine online, you've got Cartoon Brew, you've got affinity groups like Women in Animation, Black and Animated, some really interesting podcasts like Animation Happy Hour, where they talk about how they broke into the field. You want to educate yourself as to your rights as a creator, whether it's of comics or of animation, using things like the Graphic Artists Guild Handbook of Ethical Pricing, and other resources that I give them. Like you want to just absorb as much information as you possibly can about trends and opportunities.
Thank you.
You know, in all the years we've been doing this podcast, I think you're the first person to ever mention the Graphic Arts Guild Handbook, which
Oh, it's
I used to live
good.
by when I was in that industry. So
Well, and for several years, like they only updated a few, you know, they don't update it on a super regular basis, and
right,
they had not updated it for quite a while, but they managed to get a 17, and it's the 17th edition. It's the most current one. You can find older ones online, but it's a yellow cover. It's the 17th edition, and it was actually updated in 2020, kind of just as COVID broke. So it actually even starts to address some of the changes there, but it also like brings comics much more into the equation. It has baseline information on journey level weekly rates for animation work, and it has a ton of legal information about doing your own contracts, understanding copyright, trademark,
it's a
all
great
this.
it's a great
Yeah, it's a great book. I recommend it to anybody. It's a big book, but it's worth it. It's really good for self-education.
Anybody else have questions? Yes,
Is it-
Aisha. We'll get to Greg after Aisha.
Hi. This is my first workshop here, and I just joined the comic book group on Facebook. I'm an editor, I do literary editing so far, and I'm really interested in getting into comic editing as well because, as you said, comics are my first love. It's the first thing that was put into my hand that I consciously remember reading it, and those were Archie comics before me. So, I'm wondering what kind of scope there is in this, how much um editing, textual editing is involved in comics.
So I guess the basic question is, how is it different from editing prose? Yeah. And I actually did a little prose editing during my freelance days, and I have to tell you, I was like totally overwhelmed. I was like, oh my God, you mean you have to write a whole manuscript at once, 300 pages, and then edit the whole thing? Because in comics, it's so much more piecemeal. I was like, oh my God, this is so much work. So have you looked at like how comic scripts are formed? So there's a couple different ways they're written, but the most common one sort of, lays out the panels and describes what's happening in each laid out section of the page, and also gives some very broad stage directions. And it's sort of, it's still the same as regular editing in that you ask yourself the question of, well, is this character's innate personality coming across in their dialogue and the actions that they take and their motivations? But also, like, is the 3-act structure of the story working? Is the beginning working? Is the middle working? Is the ending working? The sort of, I guess the part that's most unique about the text editing is that you sort of learn over time, like how much text can fit on a page. And that was always in the early days of graphic novels. That was probably always the biggest challenge. Like, we all grew up on, at least in the States, on Classics Illustrated, and they were just, very literal recreations of classics that had like big stretches of text and maybe a little bit of dialogue, and then there was just like this much left over for the illustrations. And comics have come a long way in that you start to figure out not just how to economically, place the text so that the action is not obscured, but also like what parts of the action can fill in for the text, how you can show instead of tell. Like, that's what's kind of cool about editing comics is that you have that option. You're like, what part of it is most effective to tell and which part of it is most effective to show.
And Aisha, sometimes you have to be part art director too.
Yeah, definitely.
Because you have to make sure that the story is clear based on not just the words, but also the visuals.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mean the placement of the dialogue bubbles and things like that?
No, but you want to make sure that, because sometimes you're telling the story visually rather than with text, right? And you want to make sure that the reader will still understand the story based on the visuals alone. I think years ago somebody said, maybe it was Larry Hamill, said that if you can tell the story without the text, then it's working. I'm not sure I agree with that completely, but but I think there's a little bit of truth to that.
Well,
Yeah.
and it's also about working with the author, right? And if you've done literary editing, you know that sometimes an author is like doing great without your guidance, and sometimes you're like, okay, they think this is working great, and I, as the editor, now have to explain to them that what they think is working in their head is not really coming out on the page. And sometimes that works out like double. So it's the same thing with comics, right? You're like, I understand this is what you're trying to do, but this is what I, as the first reader, is seeing. So how can we fix this? And you learn to kind of negotiate with them and say, like, is there a way you can focus more on this part of the action, whether it's the visual or the text, to sort of get that point that you want to make home instead of throwing in all these other stuff? It's a very similar process. You just learn by doing.
Thanks, Aisha. Gregory, you had a question.
Oh, it was just a quick follow-up on the handbook.
I'm sorry. We'll get to you. Let's go to Greg Maldonado.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Ramon. Hey, Joan. My question is during your time as an editor, what were the key skills or the key abilities that you look for in a creator or specifically an artist or writer that you wanted to put on one of your books?
Um, being obviously being talented, but like being a team player, being somebody who is willing to sort of work together with someone to create the best version of their work, to take suggestions, to counter propose ideas if they feel like, you know, what I suggest isn't working. I look for people with a very unique voice. Even if it's a little bit raw around the edges, if it sort of like sounded like nobody else, or was just something that just kept me like turning the pages because the art was so distinct, or turning the pages because the pacing was so good. Like, and maybe like the art's a little raw, or maybe they like, you know, have turned in just their first comic script, and you know that some of it is a little funky and overwritten, but I just can't stop looking at it. You know, that I would say those are qualities that attract me. I mean, to give you an example, one of the first creators I acquired as a graphic novel editor for Vertigo was actually G. Willow Wilson. I was introduced to her by the comic creator Keith Giffen, and she had actually been a journalist who had been wanting to get in comics because she was a big Marvel geek, and she'd been pitching like Daredevil ideas for a while, and she sent me these pitches that were interesting, but like, I don't know, didn't seem quite right. And then she also had this idea for a series called Cairo, and she wanted it to be a maxi series like Watchmen, which nobody was doing anymore, but the pacing was so good. I was like, I can't stop reading this. And we eventually acquired it and made it into a graphic novel because that just happened to be the form that it worked in. So like the way that she was pitching it wasn't quite there yet, but she was so good, like, you know, we knew we wanted to work with her.
Thank
Okay.
you.
We'll take a question from Greg Stevenson, and then I have a question from Bob.
Okay, mine was just a comment on the handbook. I was asking if it was available in Audible, but since then I looked it up. And it is available on Kindle with speech enabled, but not Audible. And there's also a spiral bound edition, which sounds like it'd be very valuable.
Yeah, it's not a narrative. It's literally a handbook with like
Okay,
charts and things like that. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and it has a lot of sidebars, like it has a lot of charts that have like page rates and stuff like that. So it would be hard to make an Audible, and you know, it's an investment, but I feel that it's worthwhile, especially now that there's an up-to-date 17th edition, because the one before that had not been updated since 2015 or so, and so much has changed. But it's definitely worth it.
so Bob had a question. Bob's question on the chat was, how do you start as a comic book or animation writer?
Well, they're different. Definitely different. I mean, you network. Again, you educate yourself as to what the networking opportunities are for each industry. And I don't know, is this group a New York-based meetup group, or at least New York, New Jersey? Or are you from all over?
I think about half are from New York.
I'm
Okay.
Southern
From the
California.
other side of the world.
Okay.
Sure.
I mean, you look for the networking opportunities, whether they're cons in the New York City area, or Thought Bubble in the UK, or digital opportunities like the Short Box Comics Fair, which is an opportunity for up and coming creators to submit their works and sort of participate in an online comics convention. The traditional way to break into comics writing is not really there anymore because the mainstream companies have been harder to break into than ever. I feel that like I personally am okay with like fan art and fan fiction. It's often how people have gotten their first jobs, because what's happening these days is that companies don't really have submission departments anymore. Some still do. Like if you go to the Dark Horse Comics website, they have a very good submissions page that clearly lays out how you can submit samples to be considered for writing, or submit samples to be considered for penciling or inking. But that's kind of rare. Like more often, those editors, agents, and many, many more literary agents represent comics writers these days are scouting people's socials, websites, but especially websites, to look at what they're posting, what stories they're telling, whether they're doing it themselves or in collaboration with other people, whether they're their original things or they're sort of like a funny fan fiction take on Legend of Korra that happens to be super polished, and maybe they would do a good job on an actual licensed version of the story. In animation, it's a little bit the same thing. Again, like you want to school yourself in the sort of basics of writing for animation, and then you just want to network. There are people that have made the crossover, like Tanika Stott, who started out as an editor of online comics, and she now does a lot of writing for TV animation. I would look up to see how she made the transition, but it had a lot to do with the fact that she just had a very strong online presence. She has created a lot of really terrific anthologies that have won Eisners, and you just put yourself out there. And I can't overemphasize a web presence. Like, and my students and all the guest speakers, like all are told by me and by all the guest speakers, don't make me drop into your DMs. Like, let me see your well-organized web page where you have your best work up, so that I might, be inspired to give you your first job.
I think, Bob, especially in comics, publish, like create your own work, self-publish, and people will see that you can put together a project and finish a project. And I think you could do the same thing with animation too. I mean, what's that property? Morty? What is it?
Rick and Morty.
Rick and Morty. That was like something that was homemade, and then they got picked up, right? So
yeah,
it's doing out of their own house, and it was so funny, and it got picked up by the studios. So
yeah, there's a whole bunch of different ways. There's no one way to break in anymore. It's true.
Yes. Anybody have one question? I'll take one more question, and then I'll probably have one more question, and we'll close it out. Anybody?
I have a question.
Yes. Hey, Tyler.
Okay. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about this, but I know you said that that you got a significant boost in your career, so to speak, from your time working at Cartoon Network, was it?
It wasn't so much working at Cartoon Network, but I worked for a division of Warner Brothers, DC Comics, and they are in the same family tree, right? Because they're both owned by Warner Brothers.
Okay, well, my question is, in light of all these things that are happening, like that for the worse for animation, like the Warner Brothers Discovery, canceling all these movies and TV shows, and removing the old TV shows off the streaming services, and kind of discouraging the creation of animation at Cartoon Network and stuff, and even at Paramount, like they were removing some TV shows and I think movies too, to a smaller extent, and the CEO being just left, and now they're supposedly prioritizing franchises like yours over original projects. And now I'm not necessarily interested in going into animation, but I do feel for the people that do. And I'm curious to know if you think it's harder now, to get into animation as it was at a time when it was easy, when animation was being treated better with the creation of all those shows that were being made when you were working at like these Warner, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because there's certainly there's certainly been a lot of chaotic transformation in both comics and animation in terms of the more sort of like uh mainstream content like being backed away from because there's too much of it, and or studios don't want to take chances on the quirky or indie stuff anymore. um there are shows that could probably never make it onto Nickelodeon today, like Invader Zim. I think that's another one that's kind of amazing that it never made it on the air. But something I teach in the class, and it speaks to comics publishing, but I think also to animation, is that just because these big companies are going through all this tumult, which doesn't have to do with them not liking animation, it has to do with the fact that the cable TV business, you know, is struggling, and everyone is trying to figure out how to best affect the streaming era, and so they're taking fewer chances. But that means that smaller companies are stepping into the breach. So in the case of comics, you know, Marvel and DC have pulled back all their bets on everything but their biggest properties. But that means that, you know, Image, Dark Horse, Oni have become powerhouse publishers doing original stuff, and you have people forming their own production companies instead of being essentially sweatshop labor for the comic industries, like Robert Kirkman's Skybound or James Tynion's Tiny Onion. People are becoming their own companies. It's a little trickier with animation because animation is so expensive to make. That's why you have you have big studios commission content from small production companies, but still, you know, with companies like Titmouse, with like companies like the little studio in, I want to say like Connecticut or Baltimore that produces Bluey. You know, who knew? Bluey in its own is so unusual. Like they're stepping into that vacuum, right? So that's why I say it's important to sort of just keep yourself educated. Like just because these companies are struggling to put their own houses in order doesn't mean that there won't continue to be great original animation. It's just that, you know, the more interesting things are happening at the level of the littler kids, the littler guys.
You could
and
say,
and
Tyler, that there are opportunities, other kinds of
yeah,
opportunities.
yeah, exactly.
So
That's
anyways,
interesting.
thanks for the question, Tyler. Anyways, I think we are past the hour already. I would like to share one story. Years ago, I was at Heroes Con, and I got to pitch to Nickelodeon actually. And back then I had a comic book called The Men from DARPA about these scientists who do espionage, right? And what they told me was that number one was that there were no kids in my comic book. Number two, there were guns in my comic book. And number three, my jokes were for old people, right? So I told them, well, I could make it, you know, the kids from DARPA. And they said, that's great, but we've got, you know, like 50 other people outside whose ideas are ready to go. So I said, I get it. And that must have been 2015. And now it's 10 years later, and I finally have the kids from DARPA. I don't have a copy with me right now that I'm trying to promote as much as possible. So one of these days, I'm going to see if I can get back into the pitching room with Nickelodeon. So
Yeah,
anyway,
why not?
yeah. Anyway, so
Resilience is important. Like,
right.
don't
So
give up. Never give
I
up.
was just thinking this week, right? That yeah, rejection is part of the game. I just got to keep going.
Mhm. And there
So
really are so many exciting things happening in this field right now. So I'm glad you guys are taking this opportunity to network and support each other, because I know it's big and confusing, but it's also just a super, super exciting time for the whole creative sphere that this exists in.
I think so. But thank you, Joan. Before we go, let me just announce that on June 20th, we have Barbara Dillon, who's the editor-in-chief of Fanbase Press, as our guest. And on July 10th, we have Riley Brown, who is a comic book illustrator who's worked for almost all the big companies. So with that, I'd like for us to just give a nice thank you and a round of applause to Joan for coming out.
Thank you, guys. Great questions. I enjoyed meeting all of you, and maybe I'll see your names out there one of these days.
And I'm
And thank you,
hoping
Ramon,
to
for the
see you.
invitation.
Yeah, sure, sure. And thank you for coming out. I'm really appreciate it. So hopefully I'll see you around the circuit, one of these days again.
Sounds
So,
good.
thank you all, and I will try to get this recording up in within the next couple of weeks.
Okay. Have a good night, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.